Give us your read on China as it relates to the war in Ukraine and what that means in terms of everyone's favorite, you know, bogeyman, the possible invasion of Taiwan.
I think Xi is playing this one very intelligently. He's getting tons of free oil and gas from Russia. He's insisting they hard pipe it to the east to him so that can't be undone. He is doing everything possible to create that sense of junior partnership on the part of Putin.
Admiral Stavridis, where does this podcast find you?
I am in the northern part of Florida, near Ponte Vedra Beach. It's one of the beach towns for Jacksonville.
So I would just love to get your thoughts as someone whose name was constantly floated as a potential vice presidential candidate for Secretary Clinton and other Democratic hopefuls. Give us a sense for what you think is going on here, and if you were to attempt to speculate what might play out over the next week. This is, I don't know if it's the strangest political moment I've ever experienced. Maybe I'm much more attuned to it now, but obviously a tremendous amount of doubt around the Biden campaign, but their camp says they're steadfast in their commitment to stay in the race, but there's sort of this drip, drip, drip of party elders coming out and suggesting that he stepped down. Give us a sense as someone who's been pretty close to this and someone who thinks a lot about strategy. What do you think is going on here that the public does or does not see, and what do you think plays out?
I'll give you the historical piece, and I at least am old enough to remember a similarly difficult moment to absorb, and that was, of course, Watergate and the resignation of a president in advance of criminal proceedings being brought against him, Richard Nixon. That's a long time ago. So, yeah, we're in 50 years of kind of uncharted territory by comparison. Although we've seen now three impeachments, one of Clinton and two of Trump. So we're not complete innocents in this sort of strange season. But here's where I'm at on this one. As I watched that debate, I felt sad for the country. The choice we're being presented is, at this moment, a convicted felon with multiple character flaws on full display. And on the other side, an individual for whom I have a lot of affection, a lot of respect, but Father Time appears to me to have caught up with him, and he is not, from all that I can see, in a good place to be prepared for 4 more years. I think you could have a conversation if we were looking at it for a year in advance, but 4 more years when you look at the progression. So a bad set of choices. In terms of how it plays out, I can answer that in 3 words. I don't know, and nobody does. Literally, nobody does. Not even Joe Biden, in my view, knows how this one's going to play out. So what I think will happen over the next week to 10 days, the Democratic Party is going to have to make a choice of either putting itself 100% behind a president who seems physically frail and weak, and hope for the best in the fall, or they're going to have to find a new path. And I'll conclude with this, Professor. There is nowhere in the Constitution where it says Republican Party, Democratic Party. Someone said to me the other day, oh, they have to go with Biden because the Constitution demands it. Neither Constitution nor law govern political parties. We've had a plethora of political parties in this country, and they get to make up the rules. And so they have every opportunity to conduct a mini primary, or they could pass the baton to Kamala. They've got a convention coming up. I think we are in extremely unpredictable waters.
Does the military or the arms, do they have a voice here?
No, and you ought to be very glad that they do not. Every military member at every grade raises his or her right hand and swears an oath as follows. I state your name, do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath is sworn to the Constitution. The military will resolutely avoid being embroiled in this, and that's the kind of republic we want to be.
That's well said. There's a lot that's uncomfortable about this, but one of those things is, do you see our adversaries being more emboldened while we're in a state of chaos? Do you think they sense weakness and tumult and are more inclined to be more offensive or bold in their actions?
I do, and that is a significant risk. And you can break it down, frankly, into two significant periods of high risk. One is from now through the election. I think there the risk is going to be a malactor deciding now would be a good time to launch for example, massive cyber attack against the United States. There's distraction. There might not be a resolute response to that. It's a little ambiguous. That period between now and the election, simply because malactors, Russia, China, North Korea, etc., will have a tendency to believe we're too distracted to respond. That's one package of time. After the election, Scott, unfortunately, I think we're going to have this interregnum in which it would seem to me at least a better than even chance of one side or the other. If it's a close election, which it appears it probably will be, there'll be a further series of legal challenges. There could be untoward events like January 6th. Who knows? That second period of time until the inauguration of the new president, I think, is a second and somewhat even more risky period. So, yes, we need to be leaning forward. You asked about the military. The military is not looking internally, but I assure you, the intelligence agencies, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the combatant commanders in the position in which I served for 8 years, two different combatant commands, they are looking outward to try and see any signs of risk directed against the country during these very, I think, concerning periods from now through the inauguration.
Let's talk about the Middle East. On MSNBC, you said that you believe there's a 1 in 3 chance at best for a ceasefire in Gaza. Talk us through how you landed there.
Number one, the Israelis feel as though they have not yet completely dismantled the military capability of Hamas, but they're close. And you hear that from even from Prime Minister Netanyahu, certainly from the Israeli general staff. So I think temporally speaking, the Israelis are closing in on eliminating Hamas. And I believe I've said this to you before, Scott, but the military center of gravity is actually not Hamas. The military center of gravity is that tunnel complex. 400 miles of tunnels. The Israelis are destroying those. When those are done, Hamas loses its opportunity to train, equip, organize, and launch attacks as they did in October. So that's a military equation that is coming to fruition. I think that's pretty close. So that gets me to still more combat opportunities and actions, but probably the Israelis are getting in a position to make an accommodation. On the Hamas side, what I see is a lot of pressure. It's been insufficient so far, but increasing pressure from both Qatar and from Egypt to get to the point of pressuring Hamas to take a deal. I feel both sides are kind of closing toward it. If you'd asked me 3 months ago, I think I was saying about a 1 in 5 chance. Now I'm up to about a 1 in 3 chance. The forces pulling against it are, in addition to the two sides we just discussed, Iran. Iran would like nothing better than to see Israel continue to be targeted, as resources drained, see this fighting go on in Gaza. So Iran is kind of pulling against it. But I'll conclude with this. Now the Iranians have had an election, elected somebody, I hate to use these two words in the same sentence, Iranian moderate, but by Iranian standards, a relatively moderate candidate. There might be a little loosening of some of those activities. So when you put all that together, it's not a slam dunk, but I think it's getting close to 1 in 3, maybe even a little better than that right now.
You referenced that one of the strengths of America, and I agree, is that our our good men and women in uniform basically say, all right, good or bad decisions, it's the Oval Office's decision, and we respect the command and control structure here. I thought it was really unusual or extraordinary that the IDF publicly came out and said, we need to see an end to the war, or calling for an end to the war. That struck me as if, like, if you at some point came out and said to Trump or Obama, when in a conflict, it's time to end this. I thought that was pretty bold. Your thoughts?
Beyond bold. And from a U.S. norm perspective, that officer, she or he, would have been fired the next day. We do not want our admirals and generals, no matter how senior, opining publicly about what is, in essence, a political decision. Closest I can come to that, by the way, would be Douglas MacArthur, five-star general, a general of the armies, victor of World War II. Now he goes through and is in charge of Japan, all going well. He comes back in command for the Korean War, and ultimately the president, Harry Truman, had to fire him for his insubordination because he advocated ramping up the campaign, possibly using nuclear weapons and attacking China. We're not paying the generals to opine about that in public. So yes, I was quite surprised, verging on shock. And finally, I know the IDF extremely well. Spent 4 years when I was NATO commander. My other side hustle was I was in charge of U.S. Israeli military to military relations. So I was in Israel quite a bit, became very good friends, for example, with General Benny Gantz, the former head of the IDF, General Gabi Ashkenazi, former head of the IDF. I can't imagine either of them, while in uniform, opining on that level of political controversy. Really shocking.
Benchmark the IDF's capabilities and technology and personnel relative to the other fighting forces in the Middle East, or even, say, for example, Russia.
The IDF has advanced technology. I'll give you three very concrete examples. One, they reportedly have nuclear weapons. Two, the Israelis have among, I'd say, the top four, certainly top five cyber capabilities, offensive and defensive alike. And they have a superb Air Force that has the ability to conduct long range bombing attacks, has fairly good refueling, although they're buying additional capability from the U.S. Nobody else in the region remotely is at that level with them. What they don't have is massive manpower. They're a nation of about 9 million, about 7 million Jews. So it's a limited manpower pool compared to Iran, compared to any other potential opponent in the region. They don't have the big pool of manpower to draw on. But if you ask me, which hand of cards would you want to play? As a general or an admiral, I'd grab the Israeli military. It's a jewel.
You mentioned the tunnels, and it strikes me that every time there's a major conflict, out of it comes not a surprise, but a piece of technology that played a bigger role. Like we saw tanks in World War One, but my sense is they really had their day when Hitler, rolled his tanks into Poland and was met with the Polish cavalry. And we saw, okay, tanks are better, right? And then we saw aircraft and jet engine, all sorts of stuff, radar. You said, or there's two words, and you said one of them that struck me that we're going to hear a lot more about in terms of military strategy and technology and machinery. One is tunnels, and the other is drones. I'd love your thoughts on that, and if there are others that are coming out of this conflict.
Yeah, tunnels actually have been with us in warfare for centuries, but the degree to which Hamas was able to build this underground complex, pretty striking given the restrictions on Hamas. Comparably, the North Koreans have a very sophisticated underground tunnel connectivity system. So, yes, tunnels, I think, are something that is old but is new again. Drones, let's expand that idea. Let's say unmanned. So that means everything from satellites in space. A satellite is a drone, right? It's an unmanned vehicle. Long dwell surveillance drones, command and control drones, what you think of as reapers and predators, attack drones carrying missiles, surface drones. The Ukrainian Navy is using surface boats, drones to strike Russian warships, and drones go all the way to the bottom of the sea. Here's the third piece of the triad that I would mention. It's artificial intelligence. And we're seeing the edges of that emerging now in Ukraine, where AI is being used to direct these drone swarms on both sides of that firing line. Still very nascent, but as I look at the future of warfare, it's unmanned, cyber, it is tunnel complexes. I'm going to throw in special forces into that mix. And above all, it's artificial intelligence that will knit all of this together.
The truce that Biden outlined, kind of this five-step truce, and it includes rebuilding of Gaza. Like, realistically, and I don't mean to sound like a nihilist or a fatalist here, isn't any truce, given the history here, just kind of ready to be broken again? I'm struggling. I recognize that you're a military man, but as someone who's been considered for these diplomatic posts, what do you think? Is there a sustainable state of being there right now, or could there be?
One phrase that has always stuck in my mind from former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Pete Pace, was asked a question roughly along those lines. And he said, war will continue in the Middle East until the people of the Middle East learn to love their children more than they hate their enemies. That's a very profound line. And it gets to your point that is it possible to undo centuries, frankly, millennia of bitterness, particularly between these three competing religious groups in the Middle East? There's a fabulous book about this written probably 20 years ago. It's a great title, The Battle for God. It's by Karen Armstrong, and it's a book about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and their seemingly endless ability to find their way to war and to bitterness and hatred. So the short answer to the question is until the people of the Middle East collectively decide they are going to reject the nihilistic aspects of their religious bitterness and disagreements and free themselves from the past and the bitterness over previous jihads and massacres in camps, and there are plenty on all sides. Until that happens, I don't think there's a quick solution. Now, on a more positive note, if there is a path forward, I think the table stakes are a reconstruction of Gaza. I think table stakes are a Arab security force, not an Israeli security force, an Arab security force that takes over security for Gaza. And third, and most difficult for the Israelis to accept, some kind of a path towards statehood. I think if you could get in that zip code, then you could build on the existing diplomatic relations between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. That's the point where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia could come in, Scott, and bring a lot of resources to bear on this problem. All those are possible, but we talked percentages before. I think it's a 1 in 10 chance that we can really resolve this with something as simple as a 5-step plan.
We'll be right back. Since we last spoke a few months ago, the state of play in Ukraine.
Yeah, let's catch up. Since you and I spoke last, Russia has been on the front foot, making some gains in the northeast of Ukraine, putting some pressure on the second largest city, Kharkiv. You could kind of see Putin with some air under his wings. What has changed, and how often do you get to put these words in one sentence? The U.S. Congress did a good job. I'll say them again. U.S. Congress did a good job. Finally, having exhausted all other possibilities, they did a good job in that they provided $60 billion in military aid, which matches the roughly $70 billion the Europeans have put toward this project. So now there's real combat equipment flowing forward, and I feel the momentum is shifting back. Bottom line, however, is, as I think I told you probably 6 months ago, ultimately, I think this will end in a stalemate. It'll end probably roughly where the battle lines are now drawn, with Putin in control of about 15% of Ukraine. Ukrainians will hate that, but the quid pro quo for them would be security guarantees, a path toward membership in NATO, probably in the 3-year future, and a membership in the European Union. That's a complicated problem boiled down to a few sentences, but I think that's how this one ends up. And therefore, I think we'll probably see more stalemate, a little bit back and forth on these firing lines through the fall, U.S. election. That'll be the moment for a negotiation.
The elections are there feels like there's a leftward breeze coming out of Europe, which has shocked people. And I was reading about the elections in France, and many of us were kind of celebrating the notion that it was great that they kind of the left, center left, and then the far left got together and decided to coordinate to stave off the far right. And I think initially there's a feeling of celebration, but when I look at some of the far left policies that I think the center left will have to accommodate, they're fiercely anti-NATO, is my impression. What do these recent events and elections, new parties, what is the impact on NATO as an alliance moving forward?
I will come to that essentially tactical question in a moment. Can we just step back for a moment and celebrate democracy? In the last month, over 2 billion people voted in elections that, from what I can see, were free and fair, and delivered some surprising results. 900 million people voted in the Indian election, and the outcome was kind of a surprise, a body check to Mr. Modi. Mexico elects the first woman and the first Jew in the most Catholic and patriarchal country, arguably in the Americas. In South Africa, the ruling party gets a very significant body check. In the European Parliament, another 500 million people vote, and it's like you said, a little bit of a right wing, left wing, kind of hard to read, depends on the country. And then you live in London, Scott. We see a complete shift in the government there coming from the left. And of course, as you allude to, the results in France. Now, you can like it or lump it on a variety of those different candidates and outcomes, but I say, hail to democracy. It's delivering some surprising outcomes in some what appear to me to be free and fair elections. That's a good thing in my view, especially as we constantly, as we should, wring our hands about the authoritarianism in the world. Let's keep democracy in perspective. As Churchill said, the worst form of government, except for all the others. So that's the strategic chapeau. In terms of NATO, it's a mixture of reactions that I have. UK won't make a bit of difference. UK is going to continue to strongly support NATO, particularly having walked away from the European Union. In France, you're right to worry about the tendencies of the far left. Macron, I think, has his strengths and weaknesses, don't we all? But he has come around on NATO, and I think he will work with the left to at least ensure that Ukraine continues to get support. And that's the main ball right now. Germany, I think, is going to continue to increase its defense budget. Poland is now spending as much on defense as the United States on a per capita basis, maybe a little more, believe it or not. And there are other examples in the alliance. So overall, the elections are going to, cause that transatlantic bridge to creak just a little bit. But I think as I look at the NATO situation going forward, I think the alliance is going to continue to be in a pretty strong position. And by the way, I'll ask the follow-on question. Well, wait a minute, Admiral. What if Donald Trump is elected president? Someone who has talked publicly about pulling out of NATO. I don't see it. I think Trump, like all of us, has strengths and weaknesses. Ultimately, he's pretty transactional. I think if the Europeans continue to increase their defense budget and their spending goes up, Trump would ultimately say, yeah, that's pretty good value for the dollar for us to stay with NATO. So I think NATO comes out of all of this, certainly not in a blaze of glory, but as a pretty solid alliance.
So it feels like we're going back to Ukraine. There's some winners, right? I would imagine the industrial military complex or weapons producers in the U.S. are winners. I would also imagine that China is a big winner. They're getting cheaper oil, and all of a sudden, they become an integral, crucial partner for Russia. Give us your read on China as it relates to the war in Ukraine and what that means in terms of everyone's favorite, you know, bogeyman, the possible invasion of Taiwan.
Yeah, I'd love to. Let me start with a bit of advice for Vladimir Putin. And I despise Vladimir Putin. You may or may not know I have 50 medals from 29 different countries. The foreign decoration I'm proudest of is that I'm sanctioned by the Kremlin. I'd put that at the top of my medal stack. So I despise Vladimir Putin. But if I were going to give him advice, I would say, President Putin, be very careful of your relationship with China. You are about to become an extremely junior partner in that relationship. And think of it this way, Scott. You're the economist. You sit in Beijing, you look north, what do you see? You see Siberia, this vast, empty land space. It's the size of the continental United States. Maybe 25 million people live there. That's it. That's Russia to the east of the Ural Mountains. Here's what is there: oil, gas, diamonds, rare earths, arable land, timber, fresh water. You get the picture. The Chinese look at that like my dog looks at a ribeye steak. It looks really good. Putin is really taking Russia down a strategic rabbit hole here. In terms of how the war in Ukraine looks from uh, Beijing, if I were President Xi, I would be scratching my head. Just over 2 years ago at the Olympics, President Putin told his best friend forever, President Xi, hey, don't tell anybody, but I'm going to invade Ukraine. And in 5 days, I'm going to sweep that country. I'm going to grab that little comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky. I'm going to throw him in Leforto prison, never to be heard from again. And then I'm going to have control of Ukraine, which is full of all kinds of wonderful natural resources, oil and gas in the Black Sea, a huge agrarian factory. It's all going to be mine. That's what she heard. Here's what he's seen. He's seen 2.5 years of the Russian military stumbling around, incapable of overrunning a nation that it should have swept in the first week or two before the Western aid got there. Now Putin has missed the window to do that. So his first question is, in terms of himself, those Russian generals are pretty bad. I wonder what my Chinese generals are like. He has no idea. He hasn't had a general hear a shot fired in anger. Not a single Chinese general. They haven't been in a war of any kind since a dust up with Vietnam, and not in a serious war since the Korean War. That's 70 plus years ago. So the point is, she has a lot of doubt watching that. He also has a lot of doubt about sanctions. He knows there would be sanctions imposed if he attacked Taiwan. He's looking at what's happening to Russia. So that's, I think, a second warning shot for him. And thirdly, if he's smart, he's looking at how those Ukrainians are fighting like hell. I don't know if the Taiwanese will fight, but I've been to Taiwan. I've met Madam Tsai, the former president, President Lai, the new president. I've met their national security team. I've seen their military in training exercises. I think they'll fight. I think they'll fight hard. And by the way, that island would be a resistance fighter's dream. It's mountainous, wooded, surrounded by water. That's not an easy nut to crack across 100 miles of very difficult sea. So, bottom line, I think Xi is playing this one very intelligently. He's getting tons of free oil and gas from Russia. He's insisting they hard pipe it to the east to him so that can't be undone. He is doing everything possible to create that sense of junior partnership on the part of Putin. I think he's succeeding at doing that, and I think he's too smart to launch an invasion of Taiwan, at least for the foreseeable future.
Admiral James Stavridis is a retired four-star U.S. naval officer. He is currently partner and vice chairman, global affairs of the Carlyle Group, a global investment firm, and is chair of the board of trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation. Admiral Stavridis has published 13 books on leadership, the oceans, maritime affairs, and Latin America, as well as hundreds of articles in leading journals. His forthcoming book, The Restless Wave, a novel of the United States Navy, will be published on October 8th. He joined us from his home in Florida. In terms of economy of words, Admiral, I feel as if our listeners get so much insight in so little time. So thanks for your crisp insights.
Thank you, sir. I'd love to come back and talk about World War II with you when The Restless Wave
I would love that
comes
when
out.
things subside a bit. I would love that. Thank you, Admiral.